Hey y'all, it's your old friend Todd again. And as promised, today we're going to take a deeper dive into some of the basics of Svelte. So we're going to talk about basic syntax, we're going to talk about props and maybe how props are a little bit different than how we do them in frameworks like React or Vue. We're going to look at basic component structure and component state. That will also lead us into CSS and how CSS is a first-class citizen in Svelte and how CSS is component scoped in Svelte. And then we're going to talk about some innovative things in Svelte like reactive declarations, reactive syntax. And then I'll also start to think about maybe some good use cases for reactives and maybe some instances where we wouldn't want to use reactives. And then lastly, we're going to talk about each blocks and if blocks. All right, y'all, here we go. So the thing with Svelte is that I believe earlier versions of Svelte had double brackets. Anybody who did Angular 1, you would do something like this, where you'd have double brackets to denote that you're interpolating some kind of JavaScript in the template. But the Svelte team said, look, React showed us that we don't need to have double curly braces. Instead, we've just got single curly braces. But much like React, we can have valid JavaScript in here. So we could say plus math.random, and let's even add this so it looks a little bit better. So when we look, we'll say hello Todd and add just a random number. If you remember last time, I kind of teased that I would get to why there's an export in this app.svelte component. And the reason is Svelte, like React and Vue, and I think most frameworks at this point, is a component-based framework. And like a lot of those frameworks, the way you get data into a component is by something called props. This was sort of most famously popularized by React, but has since kind of become the standard. And so in our main.js, notice that we have this props object and the name is Todd. And in our app.svelte, we have this name variable that I've currently assigned the name of a friend of mine to. And notice that it corresponds with this prop name. And the way you get props into a component in Svelte is you make them available via the export. This is very similar to like in an object-oriented programming language, making something public. In general, the stuff in your script here is going to be accessible in your markup, but it's going to be pretty much internal to the component. By marking something as an export, you're essentially making it available to other components. So that's how this name is getting here. Now you also notice that I'm initializing it with Marky as the name. But you'll notice that Todd is actually the name that's coming through. And the reason is because this is sort of like a default parameter where you specify a default, and if it doesn't get anything, if the parameter is undefined, it'll fall back to the default. But if it does get a parameter, or in this case a prop, then that's what it'll use. And we can test this by, I'll get rid of this prop. And then if we look, it'll say hello Marky. This is not necessarily something you need to do, but this is something you can do as sort of a default parameter kind of situation. So now that we've talked about props, let's see them in action, and also we can talk about some other features of Svelte. In our source folder here, we're going to create a new component. And we'll call it reset button. And for Svelte components, obviously we need to have the Svelte extension. And one thing you'll see me do here is I've got some snippets, which will help just sort of give you some boilerplate. And if you want to install those, just install this Svelte 3 snippets by 5.3. And they're just kind of nice, helpful, so they give you some comments here. And like most comments, they tell you things that are obvious, right? In a script tag, your script goes here. And in a style tag, your styles go there and your markup goes here. But it's nice to just sort of auto-generate this stuff. So the first thing we're going to add here is a variable. I'm going to add a reset handler, and we'll just get rid of this style just to show you that you can have Svelte components that have no styling. You can even have Svelte components that have no script. It's kind of versatile that way. Let's get rid of the comment. So we're going to have a button. That button is going to have an onClick. And that onClick is going to be the reset handler. So the reset handler is going to be a prop. As we just explained, this export generally is going to mean that we're exposing this variable so that it can be assigned a prop. And also notice that this onClick event in Svelte is pretty simple syntax. It's on::click. I have come to Svelte from React, but I know that in some of the other, like Vue, there's like a v-on click, but I never liked even some of the extra syntax there. I like that this is basically just an on::click, or you could do on mouse over, and it's basically the same thing that you're typing out. You're just adding a colon. So we've got an on::click handler, and we'll add our button text here. That's just going to reset the counter. So this is a really simple component that's just going to take a function as a prop, and it's going to call that function. All right, so now that we've got our reset button, we are going to import it. And we have to give it the Svelte extension. And now we can use it in our markup. And remember, it had a reset handler, but we don't have that yet. So the first thing we're going to need is a counter, and we'll initialize it to 0. And notice I'm not marking it as export let because it's not getting a value from outside of the component. It's not getting a prop. It's just going to be some state that lives within this component. So now that we've got a counter, let's create our reset handler. And all it's going to do is reset counter to 0. And we'll pass it as a prop. So we'll say reset handler equals reset handler. But there's actually a shorthand that we can use. If the prop we're using is the same name as the prop name, we can just get rid of this and just have brackets. Reset handler means the same thing, so we're passing that reset handler function. If I save it, we've got a reset counter, which isn't very useful right now because we don't have the counter. So what we're going to do is in here, we'll add a button and we'll say clicked counter times. And then we'll also have an event here. And we're going to use the onClick event also. And then we'll do an inline function for this. And there's no real reason for this other than just to show you that you could just do this in an inline function. And we're using the ES 2015 fat arrow. We're just going to say counter plus equals 1. Let me save. So now when we go, we've got 2 buttons, and let's wrap this in a section for some semantic markup. Now, when I click the button, it increments it. And then when I hit reset, it resets it. Now there's one other thing I want to show you, and that is with the style section. And this relates to what I talked about with CSS in the first video about how CSS is a first-class citizen, and the sort of CSS and JS solution that Svelte has built into it. And so now you'll see we have a button here that's styled, and then the reset counter button. And the thing to think about with this is notice that I'm applying button styling, but that button styling didn't make it to the subcomponent. And that's because in Svelte, CSS is component scoped. So even though I'm only applying it to the button element, I'm not applying it on a class. Because the component styling is isolated to the component, it doesn't make it down to our reset button. And so this is really a feature of Svelte, that the components are really sort of encapsulated with their own functionality and their own CSS. One other thing I want to talk about with regards to CSS is, remember in the last video I talked about how we're using Rollup, which is a alternative module bundler to something like Webpack. Rollup bundles up all our CSS and JavaScript for us. If we look at this bundle.css, here's our button, and then it added a .svelte -hash, a hash that Svelte creates. And then here's our styling that we applied to that one button. So that orange-red color, the font color is white, and the border radius on the button. So when it creates that bundle, it adds that hash. And then when we inspect the DOM, notice that the button is using a class with that hash. It's the same hash as here. Svelte kind of automatically generates that for us. And notice that everything that gets output, we've got our JavaScript that's getting referenced here, but all of the DOM stuff that gets output is just, regular old DOM nodes. So remember that Svelte is a compiler, and as such, the Svelte team's philosophy is we can keep giving you new features, and even if it ends up becoming fairly bloated, when you build your app, you're only going to have the features in the app that you need. So the sizes of your bundles are only going to be as large as your code and the features that you include. So one thing they provide is what's called a reactive declaration. And the way they do that is with this syntax. So this $:, and then we'll say quadrupled equals counter times 4. And so we've got this quadrupled, and let's just say down here we'll output quadrupled. And so now when we click on this, notice that this quadrupled is automatically updating based on clicked. So 4 times 4 is obviously 16. So we keep clicking these, and they call these reactive declarations because this declaration is reacting to this other piece of state. So every time counter gets updated, we just keep updating quadrupled. One way to think of this is something like a spreadsheet, where you've got, when you update one cell, it's only going to update the other piece that is relying on it. So I have a cell that has a formula that's using another cell, and when I update that one cell, it updates the other. And that is a key piece of this sort of reactivity system that they've built into Svelte. Unlike something like React, where there's a virtual DOM, there's no virtual DOM in Svelte. It's meant to be fully reactive, in that every time I update something in a component, it's only going to update the piece of state that's reliant on it. And I think this is a really good example, so let's reset it. Just think of this as sort of the reliant cell in a spreadsheet. And this part of the DOM, this is the only part of the DOM, well, outside of this, obviously, that we're updating. We know we're updating. But this is reacting to this. This might also be a good time to mention that this is also valid JavaScript. So in the language, this is what's called a labeled statement. And if we go into the browser console as just sort of a quick way to run some JavaScript, I could say, J:, and this is just a random letter I'm using. Some var equals I'm legitimate JS. And there's no issue here. And if I console log some var, it says I'm legitimate JS. And so this was sort of a interesting, unused, or maybe randomly used, or maybe seldomly used piece of the language that the Svelte team found and decided to sort of repurpose for the framework. And so one other thing we can do is a reactive statement. Let's say if quadrupled is greater than 16, we throw an alert, too much quadrupling. And then we reassign it. And so now if we go back into our trivial little app and notice we hit 16 and now we're getting this alert that says too much quadrupling, and it just reset it to 16. Now we reset and now we run it again and it's just reacting. So not only can we do these reactive declarations, but we can use these reactive statements. Now this all begs the question, couldn't I do this in a function? Let's say I had a function called increment counter, right? And all this does is exactly what our little inline function is doing. So instead of click here, we do that here. And then maybe we'd have a function here called check for too much quadrupling. And so we'll change this to increment counter. And so now we've got our functions here. We've got our increment counter. And then once it increments the counter, it also calls this quadruple. And once it quadruples the counter, it also calls a function that checks to see. So now when we come in here, we click it, it quadruples. We keep clicking. Does exactly what we were doing with the reactive declaration and reactive statement. And so you could make the argument, okay, this is probably better practice. Maybe not so much for a trivial example like this, but you know, if you work on a sufficiently large code base, sometimes what can really save you is, you know, a really well spelled out function name. So then that begs the question, where might something like a reactive declaration or reactive statement come in handy? And one can imagine something like, what if we had a quadrupled.svelte component? And this quadrupled component just has the reactive stuff we did before. And so now we add that quadrupled component, and it still does the same thing. And so maybe if we have, you know, a sufficiently small component that we want just to be reactive, then something like these reactive declarations and reactive statements could be really helpful, because as we saw, this was a pretty trivial example, and adding all those functions led to a lot more code. You know, this helps us write a lot less code, but I think that this is one of those areas where you sort of have to find a balance. I would say a sufficiently small component is probably a really good use case for this, but as we know, sometimes our best intentions are small components, and, you know, years down the line, we think, how did we end up with this mess? All right, there's one last thing I want to talk about here, and that is that there are often situations where we have either a list of things that we want to show and or some things that we want to show conditionally. And Svelte gives us some ways to do that. In the next video, I'll be showing you sort of a slightly more advanced example of how to do that. And so in our app here, we've just got this simple app. And let's say maybe we wanted to add something to a list to keep track of it. So the first thing we're going to do, I want to get rid of this quadrupled because we don't really need it right now. Let's do sort of a multiple initialization here. We'll call it accumulated. And it's just going to be an empty array. And then we'll have a button here. Add it to the list. And then we'll have an onClick event for this button. And we're going to create a function called add to accumulated, which I apparently can't spell. And then we'll create that function. And in that function, we're going to spread whatever's already in accumulated. And then we'll add the current counter. And I'll get to why I'm doing it this way. Often you'll see in these situations, someone will do accumulated.push, the array.prototype.push method. I like this because it tends to be a sort of more immutable approach. We're just taking the current version of accumulated, we're creating a new array and adding counter instead of mutating the original array. There's another reason why I'm doing it this way, mostly because I prefer this style of programming, but also because Svelte's reactivity system is reactive based on assignment. And now that we've got this button, and I'm going to add a div here just so that it looks a little bit better. We want to display the things that are going to be added to that accumulated array. And the way we do that in Svelte is with a pound sign, or as we now know it, or as the kids call it, the hashtag, and each, and then the array that we're going to be iterating over. And then we say as, so this as is each element in the array. And I'm just going to say number. There's also a second sort of parameter here, which is I, or the index, but we're not going to use that right now. And then to close that, you just say /each. And if you're someone who's done handlebars, this is very similar to what you would do in a handlebars template. And for each number, we're just going to throw it in a div and output it. And so what this should do is when we click on the button and add it to the array, it should output it. So when we click and I add it to the list, see 3 gets added. I'll click up to 10. 10 gets added to the list, and so this gets re-rendered. Okay, so that's pretty simple. So then the question is, what if we want to do something conditional? And notice in this block also I'm starting it off with a pound sign. If the number is even, so we'll say number mod 2 equals 0, then I want to say number is even. But if it's not, we'll say else, and we have to close the if also. And if it's not, I'll just say number is odd. Okay, and then we go back and I click. I'll go up to 2. 2 is even. Go up to 3, add it to the list, it's odd. 4 is even. Let me see how that works. And so that's a pretty simple example of how we can use each blocks and if blocks in our Svelte components. Now, one other thing I want to talk about that I mentioned earlier is why couldn't I just do this? Let's say push counter. So when we click that button, it's going to mutate the array and push counter as the last element in the array. And now when I click and I add it to the list, notice it doesn't re-render the list down here. I keep adding it to the list, but it's not rendering it. And this is a really important thing to understand with Svelte, and that is that Svelte's reactivity system is based on assignment. So this works fine because I'm assigning a new array to accumulated. But when I do push, which is just mutating the already existing array, it doesn't re-render the list. So now if I save and I go back, it's working again. And notice also with counter, we're saying take counter, add 1, and then assign it to counter. So I'm also reassigning counter. In previous versions of Svelte, I believe there was a this.set method. But when the Svelte team was rewriting Svelte for Svelte 3, remember this is Svelte version 3, they decided that once you start to have a this reference, it gives you a whole bunch of constraints and adds a layer of complexity that they felt really wasn't needed because assignment, reassignment. This is the basics of programming. So this is a really key piece of understanding how Svelte works, is remember that if you want to trigger a re-render of your component or your app or a piece of the DOM or just a piece of your component, it's going to happen by assigning something in your component. Hey y'all, it's Todd. I'm just back with our quick recap here. So, we covered a lot in that one. We talked about basic syntax, we went over component structure and component state, spent a fair amount of time on props, we talked about CSS, we talked about reactive declarations, reactive statements, and then we talked about each blocks and if blocks. So we covered a lot, but there's still more to go. And in our next episode, we're going to take an even deeper dive. We're going to start to talk about await blocks and data fetching and some things that we can do with Svelte in sort of a more real world context. And we're going to do it with a little prototype Rick and Morty app that I've been just playing around with. Okay? Thanks for watching, everybody. And as always, if you want to be notified about new episodes, especially if you want to see how we get to the Rick and Morty app, especially if you're a Rick and Morty fan, make sure you subscribe so that you get notified when that new episode is available. Thanks again for watching, everybody. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you soon. So next time, we're going to take an even deeper diver, props, and some differences we're going to be... craziness.